Hello, wherever you are, and welcome to the Ricardian Podcast, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the life and times of Richard III, King of England from 1483 to 1485, and which is brought to you by the Richard III Society. My name is Alec Marsh, and it's my great pleasure to introduce two wonderful and fascinating guests for the second edition of the podcast. First, I'm delighted to say that joining us is Philippa Langley, who will be known to many as the amateur historian who led the historic search to find Richard III, culminating with his discovery under a social services car park in Leicester in 2012. Philippa has since written 3 books. She's here today, I'm delighted to say, to talk about her latest, which is The Princess in the Tower, How History's Greatest Cold Case Was Solved. Welcome, Philippa, to the Ricardian Podcast.
Thank you, Alec. It's really good to be here.
And it's great to have you here too. And this leads to our next guest, Dr. David Grummitt of the Open University. David is a historian of late medieval and Renaissance Britain and Western Europe, and has expertise on military history and the Wars of the Roses and Parliament, all of which he has written books on. To mark the 540th anniversary of the Battle of Bosworth this year, David has written an article in the June edition of the Ricardian Bulletin, that's the magazine for members of the Richard III Society, in which he explains the battle's place in history, and we'll be turning to that article shortly and what it says and tells us about Bosworth. But first of all, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Alec. Thanks for asking me to join you.
Right, well, let's begin. Philippa Langley, congratulations on publication of your new book, which I'll repeat the title, The Princess in the Tower, How History's Greatest Cold Case Was Solved. Now, this is a kind of big update on your last one, which was published in, I think, 2023. And also there's been a subtle change to the subtitle from the present tense to the past tense, which is, I think, readers and listeners will want to know about. For context, as many of our listeners will be aware, this is essentially your update on kind of the 10-year anniversary of the Missing Princes project, which is, the project you began in 2016 with a mission of finding out what happened to the sons of Edward IV, so that's, of course, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, who have sadly been known to history as the Princes in the Tower. So I think what everyone wants to know, Philippa, is what's in the new book that they need to know about.
Okay, right. Well, nutshell is 2 of the chapters have been completely revised and updated, and that's chapter 18 and chapter 19. Now, chapter 18 gives you the full scope of the investigation now, and it's really exciting in terms of the movements and whereabouts of the elder prince, Edward V, during the reign of Richard III and Henry VII. So that's a really exciting chapter now. Chapter 19 brings together all of the information that we've brought to light and the manuscripts that have been uncovered in one handy place. So these 2 new updated and revised chapters are kind of the launch pad and the entry point for a whole new chapter, which is the epilogue chapter. And this is where all of the new discoveries that have now been made since the publication of the first book, and we're now into 10 years, that's where all of the new discoveries are in the new chapter.
Okay, so that's very tantalising. The question then is, what are those new discoveries? And can you unbundle some of that for the listeners?
Okay, so what these new discoveries do, they fully support and verify the earlier manuscripts and documents that we discovered as proof of life materials for both princes. So in terms of the younger prince, researcher Natalie Neyman Bleekendahl, which many of, I hope people will remember from the television documentary and from the first book, she has found a treasure trove of materials in the Nuremberg archives in Germany. This is all for the younger prince, and what we have now discovered is there are 3 charters and a letter from Richard of England as he's signing himself with his royal sign manual and royal seals of England, but also 2 letters from James IV of Scotland and 1 from Henry VII. And we also have a contemporary chronicle talking about this individual as the young King of England who was expelled from his dominion. So it's all supporting everything that we currently have.
Okay, so there's the three charters and then the charters and the letters. So can you quickly tell us about what the charters are and what they tell us?
Yeah, so what they do, they tell us more about Richard's travels at this time. They're from 1494 to 1496. Well, actually, it's 1493 to 1496. So it tells us about his travels, his affinity, his household, but it now also tells us that he had a close bodyguard of noble men around him. So this is the first time that we've discovered this. And we even have the name of one of the individuals called Ludwig Wolfgang Tetzel.
So one of the charters here, is a charter which is signed with his royal sign manual, which is special royal signature, and it's dated to 1494, and he's agreeing to pay Wirt von Wolkenstein 4,000 florins for his support and advice, and it's got his royal seal on it. So what do these charters specifically tell us? What's going on? Who is he signing them with?
It tells us that the level that he is at Maximilian's court, because Wirt and Michael von Welkenstein are leading players with Maximilian. They're incredibly close to him, very close supporters, and they are giving their support and advice to Richard of England on behalf of Maximilian and with Maximilian. So it really shows us that this young Prince of England is at the top of the tree.
Just bring David in for a sec. David Grummitt. Maximilian, this guy, he's the Holy Roman Emperor. Most of the listeners will know who that is, but just bring in some context. Who is he? Is he the most important man in Europe at this time?
Yes, I mean he's a really important prince in Central Europe, and of course his rivalry with the Valois kings of France is well known, of course, and his influence and his importance, of course, stretches to the Low Countries.
And 4,000 florins, Philippa. Do we think that Richard of England has given the 4,000 florins? Is he promising to give it, or do we not know?
It's not really sure, but it probably sounds like he's promising to give him it because he's organising his invasion of England to become the King of England.
And I mean, that's a lot of money, isn't it, to state the blinding obvious?
It's a huge amount of money. Huge amount of money, yes. This is not small bucks.
Yeah, do we have any idea how much it is? Is it, I mean, I don't know. No. David, do you have any idea?
No, I could tell, I've been recently working out how much livres tournois are in English pounds, but I'm not sure how much florins are in. I mean, it'll be less than you think it is, because pound sterling is the big currency of account, if you like. So the English pound is worth more than, say, for example, a French pound. I mean, where does the money come from, Philippa? Do we know?
No, that's something we haven't gone into at all yet. So we're going way off at a tangent. These are the questions you have to ask Natalie, not me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so let's go back to so that's the charters. So there's some charters where he's dealing as Richard of England to important people who are very high up in the kind of circle of Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor. What about the letters? You mentioned letters from James of Scotland and Henry VII. What are those letters telling us? And are they to Richard of England, or are they to Tetzel or other people?
Yeah, the ones from James IV of Scotland are really interesting. They are to Tetzel, and you're right. And he's a great supporter of Tetzel, and you can see that this Tetzel is really revered with James IV and with Richard of England. He seems to have been a very interesting individual. But what James IV is saying is that he calls Richard of England his kinsman in this letter, and he says that he is the son and heir of Edward IV. So again, it's all sort of supporting everything that we've seen previously to that. And again, James IV's letter is signed with his sign manual and his signature and his royal seal.
So to go back to what I started at the start of this moment of conversation about the fact you've changed the title from the present tense to the past tense, how history's greatest cold case was solved. I mean, that indicates to everyone what you think, but can you just give us your conclusion on where you think this leaves the search for information proving what happened to the princes?
The project continues. What I said was I would give it 10 years. So this is my sort of 10-year report, if you like, with the publication. But I think that's why we've changed the title, because when everyone's now looking at the totality of evidences that are now presented in this new work, you can see the continued lives of both princes, and you can see it very clearly. And what we are finding is all of these 15th century documents that are telling us about them and what they did. So I suppose we are looking at the 15th century materials rather than going to the 16th century chroniclers who weren't there and weren't witnesses and didn't know what was going on. And weighing up those two things together, we can now say that the princes lived on.
And how far has the paper trail caught up with their destinies? What do we think actually happened to them?
Certainly they both survived the reign of Richard III, and we are still at the level where it looks like Edward V died sometime after 1488. Certainly he was politically dead by May 1491, when his garter stall was reallocated in St George's Chapel at Windsor. In terms of the younger boy, Richard, Duke of York, from what we can see, it does look like he was the individual who was hanged at Tyburn in 1499 when he was about 26. It looks like that was him. But one of the really interesting things that we're now looking at is what was happening to the elder prince during the reign of Richard III. And one of our exciting lines of investigation at the moment is that the Duke of Buckingham removed him from the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. And that's proving to be a really exciting line of investigation.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so look, just not long ago, the Times ran a leader in which it postulated the question to the effect of, the last Plantagenet King of England may have been subjected to one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in British history. I mean, it did ask that as a question, or it proposed, suggested it. What's your response to the leader in the Times, and what do you feel about it?
Well, I think I'd like to thank the Times, because I think it's remarkable that they've come out and put that up front. That's a real era-defining moment, I think, for Richard III and for the Richard III Society. That's enormous. But I think perhaps from what I can see is they're looking at the weight of materials that are now being uncovered. And this is what they are strongly suggesting, these 15th century materials. And
then lastly then on this particular question for you, Philippa, where does this leave you? So you've done 10 years, you said you were going to do 10 years with the Missing Princess project. Is this your last Missing Princess book, do you think? Will there be more that you'll tell?
This is my last book. However, there's a number of amazing researchers in the project. We've got over 300 members around the world, volunteers who've been searching archives. And there are a number of researchers who are doing the most exciting lines of investigation. And they've got, a way to go with them, but some of them are looking really incredible. So I'm going to be helping them because obviously I've got a massive database here which can help them with information. But it looks like they're probably going to write papers or articles, and I think some of them might be writing their own books.
Fantastic. Well, look, now, David, this is a pretty unfair question to ask you because you've not seen Philippa's new book, but you're obviously a committed Ricardian and you've written widely about this topic in the area. What's your take on what you've been listening to in the course of the last 10 minutes?
I mean, I think it's it is genuinely exciting, isn't it? I mean, there is, as Philippa said, there is more evidence that has been found, and crucially, there's more evidence to be found, and I think for me, as you know, I mean, there are all sorts of arguments which don't call into question what's been found, and don't call into question its what it says, but call into question, if you like, some of the complexities behind it. And I think the more evidence we find, the more of those questions are answered or are you're able to put a different take on it. So the dial is moving. There's no doubt about that. Particularly, I think, in terms of the younger of the princes. And it was interesting. I was reading about it this morning, just in preparation for this, and reading some of the evidence. But the point you make about the Duke of Buckingham, that is something which we know that there are arguments that the statements made that the Duke of Buckingham took Richard from the Tower, and where you have one source that says that, you think, oh, okay, well, that's one source. But where you get more sources saying that, and where you get different sources, if you like, sort of interpreting that and talking about that, and that you're able to put two and two together, it becomes a more compelling argument. I mean, personally, for me, I'm not quite sure we're there yet, but I absolutely recognise, particularly in respect to the younger of the princes, the weight of evidence is growing and the dial is moving. And as I said, and I think this is really, really important, there is clearly more evidence out there. One of the things that, just from my own research, I'm sort of struck by how important continental sources are in understanding what's happening in England in the 15th century. And I think, Philippa, that's one of the really great outcomes of the project. It's made all of us think about these foreign archives, that there is material out there. And English historians have been very, very bad at using foreign material in understanding the domestic politics of the 15th century. The other side of that, of course, is that one of the things that continental observers is that they are very confused by English names, English politics, and events in England. And for me, just particularly on the fate of the two princes, it seems to me very clear that people just didn't know. The confusion and the various sources that we have really sort of shows me just how much confusion there was, just how much rumour, speculation. I think if anybody had known for sure, we would have had more conclusive documentation. We don't know for sure, and the people at the time don't seem to know for sure.
If I could jump in there, because obviously we've got to remember that there's a new king on the throne, and he's the mortal enemy of the previous king. And so what we can see again with the 10-year project is we can see the amount of the destruction of documents that was undertaken by Henry VII for the reign of Richard III. But also what you can see is what people said in private was very different to what they said in public. So we have a couple of examples of that. We have Thomas Tyrrell, who was part of the Tyrrell family. We have a report from one of Henry VII's spies from when he was having a meeting at his home, and Tyrrell is talking about the younger prince in terms of the claimant to the throne, that is Richard, Duke of York, or who Henry VII called Perkin Warbeck. And he says in this meeting, he says that he is the younger son of Edward IV. And he actually says that, and we've got it in writing from Henry VII's spies. But again, if you look at public pronunciations, you have Queen Isabella of Spain and King Ferdinand of Spain publicly saying that this individual was an imposter, and that's their position. But again, when you dig deeper and you look further, you can see that their secret code for themselves and their ambassadors and their spies make it very clear that the individual was the Duke of York and the son of Edward IV.
I think what's really interesting what's interesting. I'll ask you this, David, as well. But if you look at these charters with the royal seals and the sign manuals, the sums of money involved, the people who are signing them off, and the closeness to Maximilian, and the way these people's lives are connected. Richard Duke of York marries the cousin of the King James, etc. All these sorts of things. This is either one of the greatest conspiracies in history, or he was who he said he was. Because to get all these people to go along with it, oh yes, they might have hated the King of England, they hated England and wanted England, but this is a really deep conspiracy. It's really Hollywood stuff, actually.
Yeah, it is a deep conspiracy, perhaps, but it's also actually just that that sense of people not knowing, people hedging their bets, people unsure. Philippa talked about Thomas Tyrrell, but William Stanley, Henry VII's Chamberlain, he doesn't know. And he said, oh, well, if it is the Duke of York, and that damns him, that leads him to the block. So for somebody as close to Henry VII as his Chamberlain, Sir William Stanley, so this is Edward IV's Lord Hastings, for him not to know who Perkin Warbeck, Richard of England really was, I think really speaks to a confusion that is pan-European.
But when you actually dig deeper in terms of Sir William Stanley, you can see that he might say that publicly, but again privately he knows who he is, because he's organising his mass invasion for him to come. And you can see that he's sending money everywhere and letters, and he is the head of the conspiracy in England. So he's definitely acting that he knows that this is the son of Edward IV. And we have, of course, people like Sir Robert Clifford who tell us that he recognised him and
yeah. And of course, there's nothing there's nothing in it for Stanley to support a pretender.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's Philippa, last word on this then. Had this fantastic leader in the Times saying, actually, for the paper of record, casting a big question mark over the received historical perspective. Where do you think we are in terms of the princes in the Tower and Uncle Richard, the wicked Uncle Richard?
Well, I think bottom line is that we've been doing this for 10 years now, and as you know, there's 300 people been searching archives everywhere, and we've not been able to uncover one piece of evidence that one or more of the boys died during the reign of Richard III. Nothing. We've been unable to find anything. But what we have uncovered is, if you've heard a little bit about today, is overwhelming evidences of their continued lives. So I think, I have to say, I've just published a book that says how history's greatest cold case was solved. That's where I'm at, and that's what I'm saying. But the project is going to continue, and I'm sure there's going to be more discoveries to come in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Philippa. Well, look, you can, of course, read more about Philippa's discoveries and the latest from the Missing Princes Project in the June edition of the Ricardian Bulletin, the members' magazine of the Richard III Society. So we'll now turn to our second guest, David Grummitt. You've written about the impact of the Battle of Bosworth, which took place 540 years ago, for the June edition. The headline of the article is 1485 Bosworth, the summer's day that changed British and world history. Could you begin by giving us a flavour of the article? Did Bosworth really change history?
Well, I should say, Alec, to begin with, that it is, of course, a work of a counterfactual history. So the article is about what would happen if Richard had won the Battle of Bosworth. So what would happen if it was Richard III who was having that symbolic crown wearing on the evening of the 22nd of August rather than Henry. And it's really a sort of exploring at a very broad level the extent to which history is changed by individuals. So counterfactual history, in a way, is grounded in chaos theory. It's grounded in, if you like, the butterfly effect, that the smallest incident or the smallest individual event can have a ripple effect and can really change history in a big way. And there's a long tradition of writing counterfactual history. Winston Churchill wrote actually a counterfactual history of what would happen if the Confederates had won the Battle of Gettysburg. So I'm clearly in good company in these kind of imaginative acts. I'll let readers make their mind up. But I suppose one of my major things was about Richard's marriage, and that we can, I think, be pretty certain that Richard would have remarried had his reign continued. It's most likely that he would have married an Iberian princess. what effect that would have is a really interesting question, because, of course, Richard was not the only 15th, 16th century English king to marry an Iberian princess, because Henry VIII did, of course. And in some ways, Henry VIII's marriage to an Iberian princess changed British history forever, because it ushered in the Reformation. What it didn't do, of course, was change the, if you like, the grand strategic priorities of England, which was rivalry with France. Would Richard's marriage to an Iberian princess have ushered in a Reformation in the same way? I argue probably not. If Richard had had children, if Richard's son had, say, come to the throne in 1520, his tutors would have warned him about the dangers of the new learning. But there's nothing to suggest that England would have become a Protestant country. England wasn't a Protestant country at the end of Henry VIII's reign. It really wasn't a Protestant country until around 1600. So the article is really trying to balance the responsibility of individuals and the effect of individuals on history with some of those broader themes in history.
Okay. But you do come down and say some things that you think would have possibly been different in the article.
Yes.
So, Carl, let's draw you on some of those.
Okay, so I think one of the things that could well have been different is England's involvement in the New World. So rather than the sort of the very hesitant colonization of Virginia, or Elizabeth's half-hearted attempts to intervene with the Spanish slave trade in the Caribbean, we could have had Central America speaking English from the early 16th century onwards. Richard, at the head of a if he'd married Joanna of Portugal, head of a very powerful Anglo-Portuguese bloc, which could really have been a real rival to Spanish ambitions in the New World. Richard could have been involved in an Iberian civil war. The Iberian Peninsula had been racked by civil war for much of the late 15th century. That may have provided Richard with an opportunity for the kind of chivalric display, the kind of chivalric warfare that he might well have wanted to take part in. If he'd married a Castilian princess, the role of English crusaders, perhaps, in driving the Muslims out of Granada in the 1480s and 90s. And we know Edward Woodville went, but there could have been others, and that could have been sponsored by Richard. So there are all sorts of ways in the sort of the short term, I think, that Richard's victory would have changed English history. As we go on in time, of course, the ripples from other butterfly effects come out as well, and the butterfly effect of Bosworth, I think, would become less significant. So I end by saying it's really impossible to say, for example, how Ricardian England would have dealt with even the 30 Years' War, let alone the kind of French Revolution or the rise of fascism in the 19th and sort of 20th centuries. But in the short term, I think we can identify some areas very much where Richard's victory would have made a real tangible difference, not only to British history but to European history as well.
And before I bring Philippa in on this question, obviously you're well versed in Tudor history, so you know what the Tudors got up to. How different do you think kind of 30 years of Ricardian rule would have looked? In terms of the way that our
and I think this is an interesting one, because I think when we think of the Tudors, there are two things. I think there's one thing in particular which the Tudors are synonymous with, and that's the tyranny of Henry VIII. So that last decade of Henry VIII's reign, where he destroys the medieval fabric of religion, where he squanders the entire wealth of England on war. What we're perhaps less aware of is the really fundamental changes that are precursors to that, particularly precursors to the Reformation, which are those building blocks of English law and English sovereignty, which come not particularly from the king, but from the common lawyers. And that commitment to justice and equity that we see, for example, in Wolsey in Star Chamber, or Wolsey as Chancellor, is very similar to the kind of justice and equity we see with Richard and the Court of Requests. So the idea of the equitable jurisdiction, that the common law has become very unwieldy, that it's very difficult to get justice at law, that is one of Richard's concerns, but it's also a concern of someone like Wolsey. Now, you could say that's simply because Wolsey wants to concentrate power in the hands of the king, but I'm not sure that Richard would have been adverse to concentrating power in the hands of the king, because what that does is not... what it does is it takes away those areas of the realm which are outside of the common law, so some of the peculiarities in the north of England, the marches of Wales, and brings them into a justice which is king-centred justice. And that's a really powerful movement which is there in the 15th century and comes to fruition in the early 16th century. I'm not sure that Richard would have necessarily have changed that, although, of course, Richard's commitment to justice is very different to the type of paranoid tyranny that we see of Henry VIII in the 1530s and 1540s.
I think it's intriguing to think of Richard III and Cardinal Wolsey operating in the same room. Philippa, let's bring you in. What's your sense of what a reign by Richard III would have been like, assuming he emerged victorious on August the 22nd, 1485?
Well, I think I really like what David's doing with this. It's a really interesting scenario, isn't it, to pitch this? But I think what you can see with the two Yorkist monarchs is you can see that we were on a trajectory, because they were operating a system of limited monarchy, because they were operating through Parliament. And like David has said, you can see that Richard was really, really interested in justice for the common man and raising the prospects of the common man in terms of getting justice. So if that had continued and we hadn't had the slight right turn that we took in terms of the Tudors and going into more of the French style of governance with the absolute monarchy, I know it's a gossamer fine thread and it is arguable, but I think I would say that we wouldn't have had the English Civil War and we wouldn't have had the killing fields of England, because I don't think there would have been that clash, that head-on clash between the common man and the monarch.
Well, you're nodding there, David. What
I was nodding and sort of agreeing, because the danger in all of this, of course, is that problems start when kings go to war, and kings always like to go to war. And I don't think Richard would have been any different. Richard loved war. All kings loved war, because knights love war. What's the point in being a knight if you don't get to fight, sort of thing? Put on your armour and invade France. That is what is expected of a king, and it's what the knightly class expect. The problem with that, and of course it's a problem that becomes even more acute in the 16th and early 17th centuries, is war costs a lot of money. And if Richard had had to go to war, and we see this with Edward IV in the 1460s and 1470s, war costs money, and if the war doesn't give the results that the realm expects, then the relationship between a king and his subjects can become very strained very quickly. And in a way, that's what happens with the early Stuarts in the 1620s and the 1630s. They have to ask for taxation to fight their wars in Ireland and wars in Scotland. And Parliament says, well, hang on, if we're going to give you taxation, we want something in return. And the kings, just like Elizabeth, are in too much of a rush. Say, oh, no, that's not what Parliament's about. We want to have our money, and then we want to go and do whatever it is we want to do as kings. Now, one of the arguments I've made about the 15th century generally is that it has this proto-democratic moment after 1399, where the weakness of the crown and the weakness of the Lancastrian crown, both financially and in terms of legitimacy, means a greater reliance on Parliament. And not just Parliament as an institution, but the Commons as represented in Parliament. And I think, Philippa, this is perhaps where we're using the same terms, but we mean in slightly different things. So when I talk about the commons, I mean it as almost as an abstract principle, the commonwealth, an idea that the king works for the good of the realm. When I think Ricardians sometimes use the term commons, they sometimes misapply that to mean ordinary people, if you like, or people down the. Now, those ordinary people are very much part of the commons, and one of the things that the Tudors do, of course, is try and push those people outside of the Commonwealth. So Henry VIII, of course, when the Commons of Lincolnshire rebel in 1536, Henry says, "Who are you? The mere commons of our realm, and that of one of the most brute counties of our realm, to ask, what a prince does. Who are you to tell your prince what to do?" Now, Edward IV and Henry VI knew that they couldn't do that. They were not strong enough to do that. They had to rule with the assent, in inverted commas, of the commons, of the community of the realm, and that's, I think, a really important distinction.
And Philippa, where do you stand? Do you think does that hold water, this sense of understanding of the word commons? But also, I also know that you regard Richard as something of a proto-democrat as well.
Yeah, I definitely do, because you can see this in his work as Duke and his work as King, that the man never changed. And I would fully support that he saw the common man. He could, you would think as a royal Duke, these people should not have been on his radar in any way, shape or form. But they were, and he helped them. And we can see all of these instances where he actually saw them and helped them. And I think for Richard in particular, I think that was a thing, because we have so many evidences for it. And I do believe that he wanted to help the ordinary people, us, you, me, David, the ordinary man in the street.
No, we're running out of time, Dave, so we have to move
Okay.
on. I think it's an intriguing question, that this sense of, because undoubtedly the Tudors were more totalitarian, weren't they, and than what had gone before, and we know that the divine right of kings, that's what kind of led to a big cause. Let's not get into the cause of the English Civil War, we'll be here forever. But it's definitely a big part of that. So I think it's quite an intriguing supposition. Look, quickly then, on to Bosworth, David. We'll still ask one quick one for you, because we are really out of time. What's your sense of the importance of Bosworth in the pantheon of great British battles, the battles that changed his history? Where is it up there with Hastings, or is it above? Was it Eddington when Alfred beat the Danes? Where do you put it?
Well, certainly above Eddington, Alec, because I think that was something that you added to my article. I don't think I'd even heard of it. Hastings. I mean, Hastings is a huge battle, isn't it? I mean, Hastings must be the defining battle of English history, I think. But I think Bosworth is there. I mean, there's it was slightly with tongue in cheek that. That we had 1485 and all that, and 1485 being the end of the Middle Ages. But in retrospect, it is a change, isn't it? Because for all those reasons that we've said, it ushered in this period of tyranny, and that period of tyranny that comes with, particularly with Henry the Eighth, but it's also there with Henry the Seventh a little bit. There's no mistake. It's for a reason that the Spanish ambassador says, he would like to rule in a French fashion, but he can't.
Okay, Philippa, what's your sense of Bosworth within the context of other great British or English battles?
Do you know, I'm kind of with David. I think Hastings has to be number one, because there was a huge step change then. I mean, the world changed. For everyone living on this island, it changed that day. Yeah. I think for Bosworth, though, I've got to say it's number two, because had Richard have won, we'd be living in a very different world now. And I think, and I know it's arguable, but I think democracy would have come earlier. I do. Okay,
and then this other question is: do we think that Bosworth has high enough profile? Is it settled in the British psyche to the degree that it ought to be, or as a society, as a culture, is this a battle that we should remember more? Whoever wants to go first, Philippa, go on.
Okay, well, I would say probably where we stand at the moment is Bosworth is important because it launches the Tudors. So all the Tudor historians have to research and look at Bosworth because it's just the launch pad to get into the Tudor dynasty. So I'd like to reverse that and say, let's really consider Bosworth in its importance, not just for the Tudors.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would second that. I think Bosworth is probably better known for all those reasons, for good or bad. It's probably better known than many of the battles of the British Civil Wars. So I think if you were to ask people, name 3 British battles, it was interesting. I was having a conversation with someone about this the other day, and they were talking about great British battles. And I said, well, but isn't one of the greatest British battles the Battle of Britain in 1940? That's a big win.
It certainly is. Well, we can all agree on that one. Okay, well, look, I think that's probably all we have time for. I'd like to say a massive thank you to the Ricardian Podcast 2 guests, Philippa Langley, thank you, and David Grummitt. Appreciate your time and coming to tell us all about it. As I said earlier, most of what we talk about today is covered in further and deeper detail in the June edition of the Ricardian Bulletin, the magazine of the Richard III Society, which you can get by joining and subscribing to the Society, plus a great deal more. If you aren't already a member, would like to find out, please find us online at www.richardthird.net. That's Richard followed by 3i's.net. There's lots more information about membership there and member benefits and how you can join too. Also, if you enjoyed listening to the podcast, please do share it and pass it on to your historically minded friends. Until next time then, this is me thanking the guests and thank you for listening to the Ricardian Podcast. Bye-bye.